and we can get started. Hi, Chris from Huntsville. So welcome everyone to today's LGBTQ plus sensitivity and inclusivity webinar training. We're so glad to have you, and I know that we had to change this date a couple weeks ago. I appreciate everyone's flexibility. I was having a health concern and just wasn't able to make it that day, and so I really appreciate Tony and all of you for being so flexible with your schedules. So I'm also glad that we can record this so that folks that had registered maybe couldn't attend today can watch it. We'll have this available on our website. So I'm going to advance my slide. Maybe. Here we go. So some welcome and housekeeping. I just want to give an overview of where we're going to go today. So the first task for us is to build baseline knowledge about LGBTQ folks and about how to build more inclusive and safe spaces for them. And that might be where you work or, you know, in your community otherwise. So that's the first thing we're going to do. We're going to then move into talking about some discrimination that is faced by the LGBTQ community, and Tony's going to talk about that. And then I'll talk about some of the health disparities that come from, are a direct result of that discrimination. And then we'll do a skills building exercise because it just wouldn't be an Alabama campaign training without some skills building. I do want to give a disclaimer that we are doing a very broad overview. We only have an hour and a half together today, and so that is just simply not enough time to touch on everything that is important for you to know about how to be sensitive and inclusive to LGBTQ people. So I just really encourage you to take this baseline that we learned today and grow that. We have some resources at the end that may be able to help you with that. And I also want to note that language and knowledge is constantly shifting in this area in particular. So language that I use today is based on my best knowledge of language that is being used, but that may change in a year or even sooner. And so I just bring that up to note that language is constantly shifting and we should continue to grow our knowledge. A couple other things. I am so sorry, I didn't even introduce myself at the beginning of this. I'm Christina Clark-O'Karmas. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the executive director at the Alabama Campaign for Adolescent Sexual Health. And my co-trainer today is Tony. I'm gonna let him introduce himself.
Hey everyone, my name is Tony Kristen Walker. I'm the Director of Prevention and Community Partnerships for AIDS Alabama, and I also sit on the Board of Directors for the Alabama Campaign. My pronouns are he, him, and his, and is that all? I think that's it, right?
Yeah, that's great. Perfect, thank you. So most of you have taken a moment to introduce yourself in the chat box. I appreciate that. If you haven't, you can still do that. We are recording today's webinar. It will be available on the website after today. And then I want to encourage you to utilize the Q&A. There's a chat box and there's a Q&A box. And the Q&A box is where I would like you to put your questions. And we will have some time at the end to answer those questions, but if they're there, they won't get lost in the chat box. So you can put those in there throughout the training today, and we'll get to them at the end. So because we are speaking sort of about a sensitive topic, I did write some group agreements for us to follow for today. So to get us started, the first thing is I want this to be a safe space for all participants. And so that means that it should be a judgment-free space where we're respecting one another. I also want us to assume positive intent with every question and comment that might come through. We are all here to learn. However, I also want to bring up our third agreement here, which is to be mindful of the impact of your words. So just because the words that you use, you don't intend them to harm someone or hurt someone's feelings, that's not always the impact, right? And so I'm sure there's many times where we come across a situation where we're doing our best to ask our question in a sensitive way, but maybe we didn't fully think about how it could be received. And so I just encourage you to think about the words you use when you're asking your questions and making your comments today. But also noting that it is a learning environment, and so please do participate and ask those questions and make comments. And I hope that these are good with everyone. And if you have any additions that you'd like to make, you can put those in the chat. And again, if you have any questions about anything, you can put that in the Q&A. So the first thing we're going to talk about today in building our baseline knowledge is language. So some of you may have seen this or used this before. This is the gender unicorn. It was created by the Trans Student Educational Resources. And it shows the difference between gender identity, gender expression, sex assigned at birth, and then also physical and emotional attraction. And so there's lots of things I like about the gender unicorn. One, it shows that these are all different spectrums. So it's not all on one spectrum. These are all very different things. But second, it kind of shows where each of these live. And so gender identity is annotated here with a little rainbow. And so gender identity is largely something that happens in the brain. It's how do I feel about myself? How do I think about myself? What gender do I identify with? And that's largely happening in your brain. Whereas expression, which is annotated with the green here, and you can see it here, expression is how we carry ourselves through the world. And so that may or may not match up with the identity. They're different things. Sex assigned at birth, you can see here's this little DNA, and you can see is sort of in the area where the genitals would be. And so that's because that's where that is on our actual bodies. Is the sex that is assigned to you at birth is, the doctor pulls you out and says you're a boy or you're a girl. In some cases, they may say this is an intersex child, and then oftentimes the parents will make a decision about whether to raise that child as male or female, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. But just to point out that sex assigned at birth really is about the genitals that you were born with. And then physical and emotional attraction really live. These are more of, I guess you could say, heart issues, or however you choose to think about how you are attracted to people. But it's really it's about that attraction, and so it's different even than how you think and how you put yourself out there in the world. And so I just really like that, because I think it's very clear that these are all different things, but they're all sort of tied together also. So let's talk more specifically now. Let's break it down further. So for sexuality, sexual orientation or identity falls under sexuality. So sexual orientation or identity is the sexual concept of one's self based on feelings, attractions, and desires. So we just talked about emotional and physical attraction. So some examples of sexual orientations would be gay, lesbian, bisexual, straight, queer. And that's very different from sexual behaviors, or can be very different from sexual behaviors. Sexual behaviors may be different or they may match, but sexual behaviors are who we're actually engaging in sexual activity with. So men who have sex with men may or may not identify as gay. Someone who may identify as bisexual may only end up having sex with one gender. And so we can't assume orientation based on behavior. And I just think that's especially important for those of us who are working with young people, who are working in the sexual health field, to be mindful of that and to not make assumptions. So this is going to be really, again, this gets back to this being a broad overview. This is not an exhaustive list, but I wanted to give us a good starting point of sexual orientations and identities. So the first we're going to talk about is asexuality. So this describes a person who does not have significant sexual attractions. So romantic, emotional, physical attractions, as well as partnered relationships may or may not be present. Bisexual describes a person who is attracted to two or more genders. And at bisexual, we're going to talk about another orientation here in a minute, but bisexual, bi means two, so it's really they're attracted to men and women, because that differs from another orientation. So gay, of course, describes a person who is attracted to a person of the same gender, and that can refer to a man who is attracted to a man, or it sometimes refers to women who are attracted to other women. It's almost a catch-all term. Heterosexual is a person who's attracted to a person of a different gender. So a man who's attracted to a woman who's attracted to a man. Lesbian is a woman who's attracted to other women. So pansexual is sort of what I was alluding to when I was talking about bisexuality. So pansexual describes a person who is attracted to people of all genders or regardless of gender. And so that's how it differs from bisexuality. Bisexuality really is looking at a binary man and woman, whereas pansexual is looking at a much larger spectrum of genders and ways that people identify their gender.
Christina, I want to interject right there. I think it's important for people to know that when you're having these discussions, that I think we've used sex and gender interchangeably for so long, and now being that we're making a distinction, I think it kind of throws people for a loop. But we always say the opposite sex, we really mean the opposite gender. Just something to be mindful of when you're talking to people about this.
No, that's a great point. And even as I was putting together this presentation, I was struggling. Am I saying the opposite sex? Am I saying the opposite gender? I don't know. And so I just chose one that because it was based on a resource I was using, and I stuck with that one. But yeah, that's a great point. And then queer is, again, sort of a catch-all term. It means not heterosexual. Sometimes it's used as an umbrella term for many non-heterosexual identities. And you may remember or can think of it being used as negative or pejorative, but the LGBTQ community has largely taken that word back and used it to their own benefit. So then moving over to gender and looking at gender, we know that gender and orientation are different, but they are somewhat related. So to start, there's sex assigned at birth. So this is how someone is identified at birth. It includes their body parts, their hormones, their biology. Whereas gender identity is the gender that a person knows themselves to be. So it's distinct from and not contingent upon the person's sex assigned at birth. And so, for example, female, male, trans, gender nonconforming, we'll talk about these, some of these words in the next slide. But just to point out that just because someone is assigned, let's say, male at birth, that doesn't mean that's how they're going to identify later in life. And then gender expression are the ways in which a person acts, presents themselves, or communicates their gender within a given culture. So for example, the clothes that someone wears, how they wear their hair, the choice to wear makeup or not. These are all ways that we may or may not express our gender, and so that's what that alludes to. So again, this is not an exhaustive list, but it does give us a good place to start learning. So cisgender describes a person who is not transgender or whose gender identity is the same as their sex assigned at birth. So I'll disclose that I am a cisgender woman. I was assigned female or girl at birth, and that is how I have identified my whole life. Gender nonconforming. So this term is used to describe a person whose appearance, their voice, their mannerisms, social interactions don't conform to traditional expectations about gender. And so they give the example here of a boy who wears his hair long or paints his fingernails. They might be described or describe themselves as gender nonconforming. Gender fluid is a person whose gender identity is fluid. So that means that it can go back and forth. It can shift between categories. For example, such as male or female, man or woman. Genderqueer describes a person who does not identify within the gender binary. So binary, again, meaning two. And so the gender binary that we typically think of is male and female. But this is someone who doesn't identify within that binary. So intersex, again, I talked about this a little bit ago with the gender unicorn. But this describes a person that with a less common combination of genitalia, hormone levels, and/or chromosomes that are typically used to assign sex at birth. So intersex individuals will often undergo involuntary, medically unnecessary interventions from a young age to alter their bodies. And this is largely, well, I would say almost entirely, the choice of the parents and probably the doctor. So if someone is born with genitals that it's not clear if they're male or female genitals, then oftentimes a parent will make a decision, or with the help of a doctor will make a decision. And I think there's been a lot of research out there that has shown that this can be really damaging to the individuals who these interventions are done to, because they grow up, you know, with, let's say, male genitals, and then, but they grow up really feeling like more female, or feeling sort of in the middle and not knowing what to do with that, and then later finding out that they were actually born intersex. And so I think this is interesting, one, to point out, because this does just naturally occur in nature, and you know, then because of this pressure from society to have a man or a woman, in this case a boy or a girl, we sort of push this on them, and then it can lead to some long harmful effects for these individuals. And then transgender, this describes a person whose gender identity differs from their sex assigned at birth. So sometimes this is shortened to trans, and trans people may or may not choose to alter their bodies hormonally or surgically. And I would just insert here that it's never appropriate if someone discloses to you that they're trans. It's never appropriate to ask about whether they're transitioning, what genitals they have, those sorts of things. You know, trans really refers to who they know themselves to be, and so it may be totally different from the sexual characteristics that they have on their body. All right, so that gets us through the language bit of what we were going to talk about today. Again, if you have questions, I really encourage you to put them in the question and answer box, and you can put those there throughout. I also want to point out that this will be available online, but also I can send these slides after the fact. I should have said that earlier. I'll send the slides after today's presentation, so you don't have to be worrying about moving too fast or you didn't get something in the previous slides. So I want us to start thinking about how we can incorporate that language into building more inclusive spaces now. So I have a poll, and I'm going to make it live now. And I want you to answer these questions in the poll. How can we refer to or describe intimate partners in a more inclusive way? Or condoms? Or sexual behaviors? And what are examples of gender pronouns? So take a minute. You should be able to see the poll. I've made it live, and just answer that. And it's multiple choice, but you can choose more than one answer. So there's not just one right answer. Some of our answers are starting to come in. So we want to think about what are the most, what's the most inclusive way we can refer to some of these things. So there's not just one right answer. You should see a couple that might apply there. Give it another minute if you'll get your answers in, and then we can talk about them. Okay, so I'm going to click end polling. If you weren't able to get your answers in, that's okay. I just want to show the results here. So you should be able to see the polling results. So how can we refer to or describe intimate partners? And so I came up with some options here, but if you thought of something while you were answering this that fit better for you, I'd love to see it in the chat box. So I put, you can refer to them as a partner, as a spouse, boyfriend and girlfriend. Although I will say for boyfriend and girlfriend, you would want to be sure that you understand the relationship that that person has before you maybe make an assumption about whether they have a boyfriend or girlfriend. A special friend, a lover. Are there any others that I missed? Those were just the ones that popped into my head when I was doing this. If I see anybody chat in the chat, I'll say it. How can we refer to or describe condoms? So we can talk about internal condoms. We can talk about male condoms. Sharnice pointed out that significant other would be another good option for how to describe an intimate partner. That is a good one and a common one I just totally forgot about. Sorry, so back to the condoms. Internal condoms, male condom. So again, I would say with the male and the female condom, you would just want to make sure that you know who you're speaking with and know that that is how they identify, or that the person they're giving it to, that's how they identify. So really it's just about, not making assumptions. Condoms that go on a penis, condoms that go inside a vagina. So those are great because they're very explicit. Sometimes if we even say internal or external condom, people might not know what that quite means. But if we're very explicit, like this condom is one that would go on a penis, it doesn't really matter if that person identifies as male or female or in some other way. If they have a penis, then they know that that condom is the one for them. And the same with condoms that go inside a vagina. So that's great. How can we refer to or describe sexual behaviors? So this was a little harder for me to think about different ways to do it, but so one way would be with genders. So when a man and a woman have sex. So that would be fine if you know for sure the genders of the people that you're speaking with. I would say a better option would be with body parts. So when the penis enters the vagina. And so I'm really thinking too from a sexual health perspective. So when we talk about something like pregnancy, well, you can only get pregnant one way. If someone is having vaginal intercourse where a penis enters the vagina and they ejaculate inside the vagina, then you can get pregnant. So that's a very explicit way for someone to understand how a pregnancy occurs. Inclusive of all genders, for example, when people engage in sexual activities, including oral, anal, and vaginal sex. So this also comes from my sex ed background. of really describing, well, what, not only when you engage in sexual activities, what are those activities? Well, those activities include oral, anal, and vaginal sex. They can also include things like manual stimulation or masturbation. And there may be some risk factors that you need to talk about in there. So that's maybe something else you would want to include, depending on who you're talking with. So that would be how we refer to or describe sexual behaviors. And then what are examples of gender pronouns? So these are all examples of gender pronouns. And there are more examples of gender pronouns. I just put a few in there. They, them, theirs, she, her, hers, he, him, his, z, them, zir. I think I'm saying that right. And there are more. And so just again to show just the breadth of gender identities, and how fluid gender can be. And, you know, we're not just she and he. There's really a much larger spectrum to look at. So I'm going to stop sharing those results. Thank you all for participating. And let's move to our next slide. So in creating a safe space, here's what we don't want to do. And it's largely about making assumptions. So we don't want to assume that all students or all patients or clients are heterosexual. So this can also be called heteronormativity, and that's a big word to say. That the norm for us, especially in our culture, is to assume that everyone is heterosexual. And that is just not the case, and it's not fair to those folks who are not heterosexual. And so don't assume that everyone that you're serving or everyone that you're working with is heterosexual. Don't assume that bisexuality is a phase. Don't assume, and we've talked about this a couple times, that orientation and attraction equal behavior. So we've said a couple times, those can be very different things. Don't assume that sexual orientation is based on gender of sexual partners. That's essentially the same thing. Don't assume that sexual orientation or gender identity is based on appearance. So how someone displays their gender to the world is not even indicative of how they may identify gender-wise, and certainly not indicative of how they would identify with their sexual orientation necessarily. Don't assume that all LGBTQ clients or patients or students are engaging in risky behaviors. And I'm about to show you, after Tony speaks, I'm going to show you some statistics to show you that there's lots of LGBTQ young people who are not even engaging in sexual health, or I'm sorry, in sexual behaviors, let alone risky behaviors. And so we just want to be careful not to make those assumptions. And finally, we want to not assume that they also have unsupportive families, because, you know, especially in 2020, thankfully, more and more of them do have supportive families, or at least have some trusted adults in their lives. So let's not make that assumption. That's kind of what we don't want to do. So let's talk about what we should do. So we want to train all the staff. So if you're in a workplace where you're working with people who are LGBT, who are young people who, I mean, if you are working with really any type of population, you're going to have LGBTQ people in that population. So you want to train all your staff with something like this. There's tons of resources that are available out there. So I'd really encourage staff training to build inclusive spaces. You want to assure confidentiality and privacy of your clients. You know, coming out is a really big thing, and it's a sign of extreme trust. And so you want to assure those people that you're serving that there is confidentiality and privacy, so that they can feel safe to do that. It's helpful to display LGBTQ affirming materials in your office, and those can easily be found online. There's even, it's as simple as having like a safe space sticker that has the rainbow flag, you know, to let folks know that you're a safe person, and it can go much deeper than that even. but display those materials so that they know that this is a safe space for them. You want to make sure, again, this kind of gets back to assuring confidentiality and privacy, that if someone discloses their preferred pronouns or their name that they use, that you're not dismissing that. And so I'm going to talk in a second about sometimes the forms that we use require them to put maybe their sex assigned at birth, but that's maybe not how they identify. And so if they disclose to you that that's not how they identify, you want to make sure that you're using the pronouns and the name that they've given you to use. You want to make sure you have supportive resources for LGBTQ folks. And then also zero tolerance for insensitivity. And that gets back even to staff training. And so just reinforcing that zero tolerance. So to go even a step further, it would be great if you could build into your workspace or into the place where you serve clients or students gender neutral or individual restrooms. It'd also be great if your intake forms or your application forms, however you sort of manage your client list, if it contains a space for gender neutral language and space for preferred names. And I share this example. This is an example of the United States passport application, which I did not know this till the other day, but even they are very inclusive. So you have to give your parental information, and it says mother/father/parent. So, I mean, they could have just put parent, parent one and parent two. That probably would have been easier, but they didn't just put mother on one line and father on the other line. They decided to be more inclusive. And so that's just one example of a way that you could modify forms to be more inclusive for people, and to signal to them that this is a safe space for them. Okay, again, I just want to let you all know, if you are coming up with questions, those can go in the Q&A box. I am going to hand my mic over to Tony to talk about discrimination against LGBTQ people.
Okay, so before I start, I do want to say something, Christina. When my husband and I were registering my son, Maurice, for school, and even when we started taking him to the doctor, there were all these mother and father places on the application, and I just scratch it out, because people don't think about that.
Yeah.
And it does give you a different sense of inclusion if you're like, oh, there may not be anybody who identifies the way that I do, but it sure makes me feel great to know that I can identify the way I want to, and I'm not going to be, smacked around for it.
Absolutely.
So as I said earlier, my name is Tony Kristen Walker. I'm the Director of Education at AIDS Alabama, and working in the HIV field, we come in contact with this one word all the time, and it's stigma. And stigma is such a heavy word, and even when you're looking at things away from HIV, like inclusion, there's always this stigma that's always lurking in the background. So I'm going to talk about how discrimination is really grounded with stigma and the way that people feel like certain people should not be able to be themselves or have the rights of everyone else. So when we're talking about stigma as it pertains to barriers to care, there are a lot of providers, even federally funded providers, that kind of shy away from issues that pertain to LGBTQ situations because of the providers. Most of the time they use a religious exemption. And, and my pushback to that is that, Jesus healed people. Like, that's what you're supposed to be doing if you're going to use a religious exemption. But of course they don't do it in a sensitive way. But being able to go to a provider and be your full self is very, very important. And also the discrimination part comes in when people are not allowed to do that and probably forced to go somewhere else. I have a friend who was trying to get on PrEP, which is pre-exposure prophylaxis for HIV. 63-year-old man, his doctor didn't know that he was gay. Obviously there was not, this inclusion welcoming mat, for him. And this is the doctor he'd been going to for years. So of course he had to find another provider. But there are also people that once this is disclosed to them, the provider will actually refer them to someone else, and because they don't want to deal with them. So that's one of the things that we look at. HIV testing, stigma, just the thought of HIV really sends shivers down people's spines. I told you about my husband, now I'm gonna tell you about my HIV. I've been living with HIV for the last 27 years or so. I was diagnosed when I was about 26. And even then, when it comes to testing, even now when it comes to testing, people just don't want to get tested. Like they don't want to find out. They don't want to know. And all that, again, goes back to stigma, how it causes people to not only discriminate against other people, but sometimes we kind of force it on ourselves. Because if I say that I need to have an HIV test, I'm kind of like, this is people's perception. I'm admitting that I've done something wrong that I should be ashamed of. And it's no, I just want to get a test. No one ever feels weird when they ask for a test to see if their glucose is high for a diabetes test or even cancer screenings. People can smoke 5 packs of cigarettes a day and go to find out they have cancer. And no one is going to say, oh, you shouldn't have been smoking. They're going, oh my God, you got cancer. HIV, totally different. You shouldn't have been doing that. This is your fault, blah, 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 blah. And I didn't realize when Christina gave this to me, but I'm thinking about the discrimination that I've experienced. When I was first diagnosed, it took me about 15, almost 20 years to find a dentist that would see me. Thank God I took pretty good care of my teeth. But a lot of providers are not comfortable with rendering services to people who are HIV positive. So even once the testing part is done, there's still a lot of hurdles that we have to climb over. Blood donations. There have been a little bit of movement with blood donations in the last year or so, but for the last 20, 30 years, if you were a gay man, you could not give blood. Because they just assume that everybody gay has HIV, so we don't want to put that into the blood supply. Well, HIV doesn't discriminate, unlike people. It doesn't care if you're gay, straight, black, white, or however you want to identify yourself. It just does not care. So recently, they've lifted a mandate. They've actually done this twice. The first time they said that, wait a minute, what was it? I'm losing my train of thought. Right now, if you are a gay man, you have to say that you haven't had sex in a year in order to give blood. Now, I can't think of any more discrimination than that when you have people who are using IV drugs, people who are just, doing whatever they want to do in the world, and there are no same rules for them. I think if you're going to put that on gay people, everybody needs to have the same rules. That's the definition of discrimination. And again, it's because of the stigma that's associated with HIV, which goes back to the stigma that's associated with identifying differently. It's also very reminiscent of what's going on right now with this whole thing with COVID-19. When HIV became a problem, they were like, well, all they need to do is wear condoms. And now we're telling you to wear a mask. And people don't want to do that. But with HIV, we were able to make gay people the villain. And right now, there's no villain that we can identify with COVID because it just affects everybody really, really fast and really, really randomly. Protections for us as it pertains to employment, even though the SCOTUS just said that you can't discriminate against transgender or people of trans experience, it still happens. I know people in Birmingham and around the country who have been let go of their jobs because they identified a different way other than the norm. We have so much more work to do when it comes to that. I was very, very glad to see what had happened here recently, but it's like a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. Even with Alabama being an at-will state, they don't have to tell you they're letting you go because you're gay or you're trans-identified. They just say, hey, we're an at-will state and you can't work here anymore. And it happens more than people think. I think Birmingham has been working on a non-discrimination order, but people can still do what they want to do if they know how to navigate the system. But there shouldn't be any reason for people not to be able to work at a place because they identify anything other than on the binary. And the last one, housing discrimination. There are a lot of rent properties that won't rent to gay people, you know, and this is a twofold problem, because not only do we experience discrimination when it comes to finding housing, but a lot of us have been put out of our homes, the houses that we were raised in, because we identified as gay. ACE Alabama has like staked our claim on housing for LGBTQ people and people living with HIV, and you would just be surprised the number of people who, I mean, it's a building that you're living in. Like, you can't catch the gay from this building. Like, it just doesn't make any sense. But there are still people who will have whatever objection that they have for providing people with one of the basic necessities of life, which is shelter. And that's just, it's what we are. Have we had some improvements? Of course we have, but we still have so much further to go along when it comes to discrimination. But all of it ties back to stigma. You know, when Christina showed me this yesterday, I'm like, put stigma at the top and put everything else under it as a bullet point, because you can identify stigma to each of those bullet points that when it goes back to people's personal beliefs.
Thank you so much for sharing, Tony. Yeah, I was thinking the same thing when the Supreme Court made that decision recently to give greater protection to LGBT employees. But like you said, in a state like Alabama where it's at will, well, they still don't have to tell you that that's why they fired you. They can still do it.
Yeah.
You know, there's like you said, there's been a lot that's been done, but there's still so much more to do. Absolutely. So I'm going to go from here and show y'all some of the health disparities that exist as a result of those discriminatory practices. So I'm going to start by, I want us to look and see, this is the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, which is done by the CDC every 2 years. They're hopefully going to be releasing 2019 data in the next month or so. But this is for the entire United States. This is representative of the entire United States, I should say. And these are high school youth. And so you can see here that, you know, sometimes I think that part of the problem is we think, oh, it's not that many people that identify as gay, or it's not that many people that are trans. But really, that's not true. Like, it's a very significant portion of the population and of our young people. So for sexual identity, the total number of young people represented in this survey, 85.4% identified as heterosexual, 2.4% identified as gay or lesbian. What I think is interesting is that 8% identify as bisexual and 4.2% are not sure. So they're still sort of figuring out where they might fall. And so, you know, when you add these three numbers up, it's really significant, you know, a little bit less than 15%. And then if you look at the sex of their sexual contacts, so of course, this no sexual contact is very representative of the numbers we see across all youth. That about half of high school youth have had sex and about half are not having sex. But when we look at those who are, of the young people who are having sex, opposite sex only, 45.3%, 1.6% for same sex only, but 5.3% for both sexes. So again, you know, we're looking at almost 7% of the population who is engaging in sexual activities. And again, it doesn't matter necessarily what their identity is, because those are the activities that they're engaging in. So these are the things that we need to be teaching to when we're teaching sexual health education. But to go a little bit deeper, so I'm going to show several slides. This first one is about the percentage of high schoolers who have ever had sexual intercourse. And then I'm going to move into some risk-taking behaviors, some of which have to do with sexual health and some of which don't. But what I'm trying to show you is, because of the discrimination and because of the stigma that is faced by LGBT people, they are at an increased risk for some of these risk factors. So just to start to show you that, so heterosexual is around 40%. So we have total, male, and female. So for total, around 40% of heterosexual high schoolers have ever had sexual intercourse. So nearly 50% of LGB, so gay, lesbian, and bisexual, have had sexual intercourse. And just over 30% of those folks who are not sure of their sexual orientation have had sexual intercourse. So to show you that LGB students are having more sex than their heterosexual counterparts, I think is just interesting to note. Then when we look at some of the risk-taking behaviors, so of those who had sexual intercourse, their last sexual intercourse, did they use a condom? So close to 60% of heterosexual young people are saying, yes, we used a condom last time, but not, just over 45, maybe 47% of LGB students are saying, no, we didn't. And so you can see that there's a disparity there. And that is likely due to, not having inclusive sexual health education. It's likely due to maybe barriers to access to condoms or contraception that they might need. And so I just think that's very important to note that they're using condoms less than their heterosexual counterparts. Tony and I talked about this yesterday, and I think it's interesting, but I do want to point out that gay, lesbian, and bisexual students are getting tested for HIV more than their heterosexual counterparts. But it's still not even at 20%, like 18% is what we're talking about. So it's still incredibly low. They're doing it more, but there's still not nearly enough testing happening. And then I wanted to look at some other risk-taking behaviors or some other health disparities that LGB students might face. And so I thought this was an interesting one, that they were threatened or injured with a weapon on school property. And you can see here, heterosexual around 5%, gay, lesbian, bisexual around 10%. Those young people that just aren't sure of their sexuality yet, over 12%. So you can see just a huge disparity here between, heterosexual and these other folks who are identifying in a different way. Of the students who didn't go to school because of safety concerns, again, you're seeing this big disparity where gay, lesbian, bisexual, and questioning youth are not going to school more often than their heterosexual counterparts because they're concerned for their safety. Bullied on school property, again, a huge disparity. Forced to have sexual intercourse. This was really sobering for me to look at, to see that, and I sort of knew it, but just to see it so plainly is the total percent for heterosexual is around 5%, whereas gay, lesbian, and bisexual is closer to 17%. It's just that's a huge disparity, and unfortunately, really just a big disparity with young women. Physical dating violence, we see a very similar disparity happening here. I did think it was also interesting that for those people that identified as male, but who were unsure of their sexual orientation, they are saying that their physical dating violence, they're experiencing that, 30% are experiencing that. And that's just really high. Sexual dating violence is, again, it's just a really big disparity, and that you can see it goes across, although I will say for those that identify as female, it's a little bit closer, and that's just because of the prevalence that young women experience sexual dating violence in general. So then we move to some suicidal ideation, feeling sad or hopeless. Not surprisingly, lesbian, gay, and bisexual young people, those who are questioning, are feeling that sadness and hopelessness more than their heterosexual peers. And again, I just encourage you to look at the scale, 60%. So more than half of those young people who identify as gay, lesbian, or bisexual are having depressive thoughts. And then in terms of attempted suicide, nearly 30% of those same young people are attempting suicide. And again, to point out just the difference between, here's the total number and here's the number of females who are attempting suicide, who are gay, lesbian, or bisexual. So that was a lot about gay, lesbian, bisexual, and questioning young people, but it kind of left out a big part of what we're talking about today, which is trans students too. And Tony talked about this, barriers to care and provider attitudes. So in 2009, Lambda Legal did a survey of nearly 5,000 LGBT respondents. And they found that almost 8% of lesbian, gay, bisexual, but also 27% of trans and gender nonconforming people reported being denied care because of their orientation and identity. So that's a lot of people, especially a lot of trans people who are being denied care. 11% reported that providers refused to touch them or used excessive precautions. And trans and gender nonconforming respondents reported facing discrimination and barriers to care 2 to 3 times more frequently than than lesbian, gay, bisexual respondents. So again, just to point out, not only are lesbian, gay, bisexual people facing this discrimination, but trans people all the more are facing even more discrimination. So we're going to move into some skills building now. And this is an exercise from a curriculum called, I'm going to hold up the book, hopefully you'll be able to see it, maybe not because of my background. All right, it's in the resources, you're not going to be able to see it because of the background. But it's from a supplemental book called Supporting LGBTQ Youth. And it's a supplement for evidence-based programs. So if you are working with young people and you are using an evidence-based program, this might be a great resource for you because it gives you some exercises explicitly for supporting LGBTQ youth or teaching your young people that you're working with to be supportive of LGBTQ youth. So it is written for middle and high school students, but I think that it's going to be really helpful for us to think about how we can be supportive of these students as youth serving professionals. So for this exercise, what we're going to do, I'm going to read a scenario. I'm going to show you a scenario and I'm going to read it. And then there's a series of questions after that. And what I would love for you to do is for the first couple questions, because it's really about identity, maybe just type those in the chat box. And then there's going to be some more open-ended questions. And if you would raise your hand, and I will try to unmute you. I haven't tried this yet, so if it doesn't quite go off without a hitch, we can always resort back to the chat box. But I would just, this is the part where you're very much encouraged to be participating, because otherwise the effect will not be there. And also it gives me a little bit of a break on talking, because I'm sure you guys are probably ready for me to stop talking a little bit. So here we go with our first scenario. So this is Henry. Henry is 15. He plays baseball. He's an excellent shortstop. He's really into music, loves to dance, and gets pretty good grades at school. He hopes to get a baseball scholarship that will help him go to college. He's had a couple of girlfriends before, which was nice, but the relationships just didn't feel super serious to him. Last weekend, he met Trina at a dance. They spent a lot of time talking, and then they made out for a long time. Henry can't stop thinking about Trina, and he can't wait to see her again. His friends have been teasing him about how much he likes Trina. They make kissing noises when Henry walks up and say, "Oh, Trina." His best friend David says he thinks that she's nice. Henry is sure that all of his friends will like Trina once they get to know her. He wants to invite her over to his house because he knows his parents will like her too. So that's a little bit about Henry. So the first question, I would love for y'all to answer this in the chat box. Where do you think on the gender identity chart that Henry would put himself? So here are your options. And I would also add that the option might be that you don't know. Based on the information, we might not have enough information about Henry to really make a fair determination. So where would he maybe put himself on the gender identity chart? So Alice said cisgender boy or male, cisgender male, likely cisgender, we don't really know. So Chris says we don't really know enough about Henry. So right, so we could make the assumption that he's a cisgender boy, or I would say 15 is kind of a boy. We do know from what we just read that, you know, he is using he, him pronouns. But it's hard to know if he's cisgender or transgender. So we need more information. So I would say that's very true for Henry. That he identifies as a boy or as a young man, but we can't know whether or not he's cis or trans. So then where on the sexual attraction chart would they maybe put themselves? So where would Henry, maybe put himself on the sexual attraction chart? So someone put straight, heterosexuals, straight, same thing. Maybe questioning, you know, we don't know. He didn't say anything about thinking about other genders, but that doesn't mean that he hasn't or that he's not. I do want to point out something that Rachel said, going back to the gender identity, that maybe Henry doesn't know quite where he is in terms of gender identity because he hasn't really been attracted to that many people before. And so he might still be figuring it out.
I want to add something else, Christina. And he may just be doing what society has told him he was supposed to be doing.
Right.
I don't want to do a shameless plug for my book, but
well, I was going to do it at the end anyway, so you can do it.
But yeah, he may just be doing what society has told him he's supposed to do because, of course, the majority is always what's considered normal.
Right. So I think that based on the information we have, he's presenting as straight or heterosexual, but like Tony said, you know, he might still be figuring that out. He might be not quite comfortable making what he really feels out there. And so, you know, it's hard to know. But based on what we do know about him, he seems like he's identifying as straight. Okay, so let's talk about some of these other questions. And again, you can raise your hand and I will try to unmute you. And you can also use the chat box. So, are there ways that this person, Henry, feels supported and included by his friends or classmates? Do we think that Henry feels supported? Okay, so Alice raised her hand. Can I unmute just Alice? That is the question. Let me see. Okay, Alice, you should be unmuted.
Okay, can you hear me?
I can.
I felt the same way, that he was being encouraged to follow the norm, kind of like go get them, and just the way peers and parents are always asking, oh, are you dating someone? And really sometimes very innocently encouraging people to conform to gender and sexuality norms.
Right. So like you wonder kind of if he had made out with a boy, if his friends would be like kind of teasing him and making kissing noises, or if they would be bullying him, you know, or, you know, doing something different. So I think that's a good point. So Rachel said, because the question is, does this person feel supported? Rachel said, I don't think so, because they're teasing him, but that's pretty par for the course for teenagers. So yeah, I mean, he does say that he thinks that if they got to know her, they would like her. And I think he does feel support from David, his best friend. Also, he makes reference to his parents accepting Trina if they met her. So that goes to the next question, which is, are there ways this person feels supported by their family? And I think that Rachel, you sort of hit the nail on the head, that he feels like he could introduce her to his parents, so that he probably does feel supported by his family. And then there is, of course, the question is, does he only feel supported because he's acting because he's straight, or because he's presenting as straight at this time in his life? So let's go to the next. If this person were a friend of yours, how could you offer support? So again, if you raise your hand, I now know how to unmute you. If this person were a friend of yours, how could you offer support? So Alice says you could show interest in the person as a person. Chris is raising their hand, so I'm gonna unmute.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
I think from the whole narrative, he seems almost overly concerned about what his friends would think of her, what his parents would think of her, and what his best friend would think of her. So if this person were a child of mine or just a friend, I would really kind of push him harder to what it is they like about her, because he or Henry, again, I'm not sure Henry's a guy in this scenario, but if Henry is a guy, you know, really push him to find out what his feelings are.
Yeah. Absolutely. So yeah, let's find out more about how do you feel about this girl? So like, he's only kissed her or made out with her. So as a parent or as a friend, like, what else do you like about this person? Okay, thank you, Chris. And I muted you again. Rachel says, I always encourage people to be who they are, so I am considered a safe zone or safe person. If they ask me a question, I will honestly answer the questions while at the same time supporting the individual. So that's how Rachel would support this person if they were a friend of hers. Okay, so I'm going to move to the next question. If you could ask this person any question, what would it be? So if we could ask Henry any question, what would it be? So Rachel says, are you happy? I think that's a great question. Are you happy? Do you feel safe? Might be another question. Oh, Alice says, what is she interested in? So yeah, like, have you talked to Trina about how Trina feels about all this? And then our last question about Henry. If this person's family asked you how you could best give support to their teen, what would you tell them? How they could best give support to their teen, excuse me. So let's say that Henry is a student of yours, or you're working with him in your whatever capacity you work with young people, and their family comes to you and they ask how can they best support their teen. What do you say to them as a youth serving professional? And again, you can raise your hand and I can unmute you. Alice says, be open and friendly to the love interest and the direction it may take. Ashley says, listen to them and support them in any way. Rachel says, acceptance is the key to a well-adjusted person. Absolutely. Maybe letting the family know, like, he needs to feel safe. He needs to feel like he can be open with you. That's the best way to support him. Great, you all had some great insight on Henry. So let's move on to our next person. Oh, and Sharni says, Ashley took the words out of my mouth, but listen, support, and understand. Absolutely. Oh, and I'm sorry, I do want to just point out before I move on to Jocelyn, let me go back so y'all aren't reading ahead, that Tony did say, how does Trina identify? Which, you know, might give us more insight into some of these other questions. But yeah, I mean, that's important for Henry to know too if he's pursuing a relationship with this person. Because he wants to make sure that Trina is safe and feels comfortable as well. Okay, so let's move on to Jocelyn. So Jocelyn is 17, serious about school and interested in going to medical school. She's a peer health educator at her school and knows a lot about staying healthy and safer sex, using condoms and other strategies to prevent pregnancy and STIs. She also likes to party and have fun. She's been out as a lesbian at her school for a couple of years and has a girlfriend, Maya. She considers Maya her primary relationship, but she also has a boyfriend, Sean, whom she calls her friend plus. She has safer sex with both of her partners. Jocelyn lives with her mom and little brother and sister. They're proud of her accomplishments at school. Everyone in the family likes both Maya and Sean, but her mom gets confused sometimes about what Jocelyn is doing. She can't understand why Jocelyn has a boyfriend and a girlfriend, and she thinks it confuses Jocelyn's brother and sister. Some of Jocelyn's friends think she's just experimenting with Sean. Some think she's experimenting with Maya. Some think she's bisexual and she doesn't want to say so. Jocelyn just laughs and says she doesn't care what her friends think. It's what she feels that matters. So we're going to go through the same questions we went through with Henry about Jocelyn. So where on the gender identity chart would this person put themselves based on the information we have? And again, we might not have enough information to make this call. Where do we think that Jocelyn would put himself? And he says wherever she wants. Absolutely. Rachel says different. Could also be, you know, so Ricky says she describes her gender differently. So that's that last one. Some people don't like to identify with any of these labels. Nothing quite fits their identity. That might be true. Trying to find her. Throughout the story that we're given, they are using she, her pronouns. So it may be that she identifies as a girl or a young woman. All right, let's move to the next. Where on the sexual attraction chart would Jocelyn put herself? What do y'all think? Actually, the narrative says where she puts herself. So this might be a good time to talk about behavior and identity being different things. So does anyone remember how she identifies? So I'll just remind you that, yeah, Ricky said lesbian. So yeah, she's been out as a lesbian at her school for a couple of years, and she has a girlfriend, Maya. And Alice, yep, lesbian. But who is she having sex with? She's having sex with Maya and Sean, a boy and a girl. And so, you know, sometimes that might lead us, and then she even said, or it even says in there that some of her friends think that she's bisexual. She might be bisexual, she just hasn't arrived at that yet. She might be questioning, maybe she hasn't arrived at that. All we know for sure is that she came out as lesbian. So we have to assume and take her at her word is that that is how she identifies. But also knowing that she is engaging in sexual behaviors with both sexes. And since that's the case, I just want to point out as a sexual health educator that puts her at a different risk for something like pregnancy. So if she was lesbian and she was only having sex with Maya, she wouldn't have a risk for pregnancy. She would still have a risk for STIs and HIV, but not for pregnancy. But as a youth serving professional who is maybe working with Jocelyn, we would want to remind her that if you're having sex with someone who has a penis, a man, a young man, a boy, that you can still get pregnant. And so you need to have those options available, those contraceptive options available as well. So let's move on to our next questions. Are there ways that Jocelyn feels supported and included by her friends and her classmates? Are there ways that she feels supported by friends and classmates?
Hey, Christina, while they're looking at that question, I was thinking she may be consider herself a lesbian because she feels like she could fall in love with the woman and just having boys fulfill physical needs for her as well.
Oh yeah, so that gets back to the gender unicorn where we're talking emotional attraction and physical attraction and them being different things. That's a really good, that's good insight. So are there ways that Jocelyn feels supported and included by friends or classmates? So I'll just read the part that is about her friends and y'all can tell me. Some of Jocelyn's friends think she's just experimenting with Sean. Some think she's experimenting with Maya. Some think she's bisexual and doesn't want to say so. Jocelyn laughs and says she doesn't care what her friends think. It's what she feels that matters. But she did also feel comfortable to come out as lesbian at her school. Y'all are going quiet on me. So I would say she probably feels somewhat supported. Alice says maybe there's not enough evidence to answer. Yeah, that might be true. She probably feels somewhat supported if she came out as lesbian. But she also says she doesn't really care what her friends think. That may or may not be true. It's hard to believe that young people wouldn't care what their friends think. Rachel says we don't know what happened after she came out. That's true. It could have been a negative experience. We don't know that it was positive for sure.
Okay, I don't want them to think that I'm cheating because I really didn't look at this part of it. But in the narrative, it says that her parents are proud of her accomplishments and they like both Maya and Sean. I think she is supported, which is why she doesn't care about what the rest of the world thinks.
Yeah, so then the next question is, are they supported by their family? And she definitely seems like she has support at home from her mom. But it does also say that her mom finds it confusing that she has a boyfriend and a girlfriend and that she's worried that it confuses her brother and sister. But that doesn't necessarily mean that she doesn't feel supported.
Yeah, parents are always having like, you know, these moments with their queer kids, like, how do I accept this and what does that look like?
Yeah. So a couple things. So Rachel says the brother and sister like her significant others. Her mom appears to be disapproving. She might be. I mean, she definitely, you know, she has questions and she has confusion, she has concerns. So she might definitely have some disapproval that's coming through, but she might be just thinking those things and not saying them too. Mom feels like she's a bad influence. Oh, on the brother and sister. And yeah, she might be feeling like Jocelyn is you know, confusing them, being a bad influence, something along those lines. Alice says everyone around her seems to be questioning her unconventional choices or remain unconvinced. It's very hard to be bisexual and also involved with multiple people openly. Yeah, definitely. I imagine all the more in high school. Let's see here. What else do we have? If this person were a friend of yours or maybe a student of yours, how could you offer support? So as a sexual health educator, I would want to offer Jocelyn support by letting her know that I'm a safe place for her to, someone safe for her to talk to, but also by letting her know what all her options are in terms of if these are sexual behaviors you're engaging in, let's talk about how to be as safe as possible. And Jocelyn's also a peer educator, so she knows a lot of this, but just letting her know, like, if you ever have questions or concerns, I'd be happy to talk to you or maybe refer you to a doctor, whatever is needed. What are other ways that you could offer support? Rachel says, I can try not to pry, but make sure she knows that I'm available if she needs to talk. Teens are mistrusting, so I would attempt to build a rapport. That's great. Absolutely. You definitely have to build that relationship before you can, before they can know that you're a supportive person. Let's move to the last question. If this person's family asked you how to best support their teen, what would you tell them? So we were talking a little bit about Jocelyn's mom and how she may be disapproving. If she came to you, you're Jocelyn's teacher or coach, or you were involved in her life in some way as another adult, and she asked, how do I support Jocelyn? What would you maybe tell them or tell her? Maybe one way we could support her is to let her know, because she's come out as lesbian, to let her know that it's okay if that doesn't quite fit her anymore. Maybe bisexual or questioning fits her better, and maybe she feels like pressure because she came out a few years ago as lesbian. Maybe she feels pressure to stick with that for forever, and maybe that doesn't fit her anymore. Alice says, you're lucky she talks to you and is honest about her identity and actions. Absolutely. Shirley says that one way that we could have mom educate her, or I'm sorry, support Jocelyn is to educate herself. So maybe there's some resources that we could get to mom, so she could better understand what her child is going through. Awesome. So I have one more, but these are taking a little bit longer. So what I'm going to do is you're going to get the slides, and I would encourage you to go and look at this next one, which is about Raphael. And I think you'll find Raphael's situation interesting, and then you can just think about those questions on your own. Maybe if you are on this with someone that you work with, you guys could talk about it together. So Rachel, going back to Jocelyn, Rachel said, I would point out so she's talking about how could we talk to mom about supporting Jocelyn. So I would point out all of Jocelyn's achievements and let her know that she's on the right track. I would reiterate to mom that she has to find her true identity. I would suggest that mom be open to real conversations and not look for what she wants to hear. That's great advice. So again, take some time when I send you the slides and check out Raphael's story and think about those same questions that we talked about. And that's all found in here too. So I'm just going to advance. So now is some time. We have about 6 minutes left. Are there any questions that we didn't get to or that you've been like hanging on to till the end? If you do have those, please put those in the question and answer box now, and I will do my best, or Tony will do his best to answer. And if you have like one for one of us specifically, just put our name on it so we know. Any questions at all? We covered a lot in an hour and a half, so don't feel shy about any questions.
Hey, Christina, while they're trying to get questions up, I do want to say that, you know, as you're trying to be supportive for kids who identify differently, sometimes the fact that we try to support them pushes them further back into whatever closet spaces they're in. I have well, he's like our first child, my husband's first cousin. We raised him since he was 3 years old. Knowing that he was raised by two gay men, he was still afraid to tell us when he started feeling like he was gay. And so, you know, it's one of those things, and even in the best of environments, you know, for children to like go into themselves and be able to tell their truths, like where else are you going to say I'm gay other than having two gay dads? You know, but he still had some ambivalence about that. And, you know, and he knew we would be supportive. But, you know, if a child who's raised by two men feels like that, imagine what a child who's raised by a man and a woman, you know, feel when they're going through that. So it's just good to be mindful of the fact that you trying to be supportive sometimes may be the one thing that they really don't want.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, kids are funny.
They really are.
They're just trying to figure it out, and yeah, absolutely, they're funny. Okay, so I don't see any questions. I really appreciate everyone being on here today. Oh, sorry, I do have one question from Sharnice. Tony, did you say it's best to say gender or sex? And I think Sharnice is talking about when we were talking about orientation and identity. And I think I was saying gender, but you said sex is better, right?
No, actually, I think it just depends on who the person is. Like, this is so confusing. So, yeah. Like, when you're thinking about gender, like gender is literally male, female, or intersex. That's it. We have three genders. That's it. Sex. Yeah. So then when you look at the genders, then it makes it that much more complicated. My thing is always ask the person what they prefer. Yeah. Like if I'm in a relationship with a woman, then she's the opposite she's the opposite sex, not the opposite gender. I think sometimes we kind of interchange those. Thanks for catching that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for asking that question, Sharnice. Okay, I'm going to put the evaluation in the chat box right now. You should all be able to see it. It's a Google form. It's anonymous. If you will fill that out, it really helps us build our webinar, our future webinars. And there's even a place for you to tell us what future topics you might want. Because as we all know, with this new world of COVID, this is really the the best way to do things is to not be together, but to be together virtually. And so I anticipate that the campaign will be doing more of these as the months go on. So please take a few minutes to fill out the evaluation. You'll also receive an email tomorrow that has the evaluation link in there as well. So if you miss it today, you can grab it tomorrow. And then we'll also have the recording on the website, and I encourage you to rewatch it if you feel like you need to, but also just share it within your networks. Maybe you have a colleague who wasn't able to be on today, and in that case, please feel free to share. So I'm gonna advance my slides here. I want to point out, thank you. There's some sweet, nice comments in here. So I appreciate everyone who's taking a moment to thank us for the training. I want to point out, Tony and my contact information is on the resources we recommend. Tony is a new author, apparently, informed me yesterday. So Walking in Truth Fatherhood is available on Amazon. And when you get this slide deck, you should be able to click on that link and go straight to it. And then these are other, so this is the evidence-based supplement we were using for that exercise. And then these are other great resources for you. So I think that is about it. Tony, any final words?
No, but you know, my contact information is on here. You can email me anytime. If you have questions about trying to talk to young queer kids, I'm always available. I know that sounds crazy, but I am. A lot of times kids may not want to talk to you, or you may have difficulty trying to figure out what to say. You know, just reach out to us, because we want to make sure that we're helping you help these kids. That's the important thing.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the campaign is happy to share resources for parents and for educators. So between the two of us, hopefully we can get whatever questions you might have answered. All right, everyone, have a great rest of your Tuesday. Bye.
Bye, y'all.